أولا أرحب
In the beginning,
بجميع المشاركين.
I
إذا
welcome
في
all of the
مجال الكنترول
participants.
إيقاف ترجمة أكون لهم شاكر، لأن
Can the
راح
control please
صوتين
stop the
صوتين في
translation?
تداخل، فالرجاء إيقاف الترجمة. في البداية أولا أرحب بجميع المشاركين
In the
وأيضا
beginning, I
جميع
like to
المتابعين
greet
لهذه الندوة
all
التي
the
هي اليوم
participants and
نسلط
who
الضوء
are
فيها على
viewing
ملاحقة
this webinar,
النشطاء
in which we are
على
highlighting
ملاحقة
the
عفوا
pursuits,
على ملاحقة النشطاء خارج
the
حدود
activists
دولهم، ولا سيما في البحرين.
outside their countries and
في دول
especially in
الخليج
Bahrain. In the
شهدنا في
Gulf
السنوات
countries, we have
الماضية
witnessed in the
كيف أن
past
هذه
years
الدول قامت
how that these
بملاحقة
countries have
المعارضين
prosecuted their
وأصحاب الرأي
opponents
خارج الحدود،
and those who have an
مما أدى
opponent's
إلى
opinion
يعني
outside their
اعتقال
borders,
الكثير
which led to their
وملاحقة الكثير.
arrestation and
نحن اليوم
pursuits
في
of
معهد
many.
الخليج
We at the Gulf
نريد أن
Institute for
ندشن
Democracy and Human Rights,
تقرير يتناول
we
فيه
would want to
صورة من صور
launch
دول
this
الخليج.
report,
للأسف هذا التقرير يسلط الضوء
which
على
highlights
حالات تم
what's going on in the
تسليمها
Gulf
إلى
countries
البحرين،
about some
وحالات
cases which
لم
were
يتم تسليمها
handed
بسبب
back to the Bahraini
نشاط
authorities and other cases
المنظمات
which weren't
الدولية
handed
والمنظمات
over to them due
الخليجية
to the
التي
activism
عملت
by the
من أجل
NGOs,
إيقاف
international
تسليم بعض
ones
النشطاء.
specifically.
نحن في معهد الخليج
We at
قمنا
the Gulf Institute,
بدراسة
we have
بعض الحالات
studied some of the cases
لمعتقلين أو
for
لنشطاء
prisoners
بحرينيين
or for Bahraini
ولكن
opponents
في هذه
and
الندوة هناك
activists.
يعني
But in
أيضا
this webinar,
دول أخرى
there are
في
also
مجتمعنا
other
الخليجي، الدول الخليجية
countries, especially in
التي
the Gulf countries,
تعاني كما يعاني
which
المعارضين
suffer
البحرينيين.
the
يعني هناك
same
معارضين
as
في
those
دول خليجية
opponents,
أيضا
Bahraini
مروا
opponents suffer.
ويمرون بما
A lot of
نمر
other
فيه
activists in
نحن
these
في البحرين.
countries are subject to
لذلك
what's
هذا
going
التقرير
on.
يسلط الضوء على
That's why
يعني
this
الهدف من
report
هذا
shall
التقرير ليس
highlight not
خلق
only
جو من الصدام،
create an
ولكن
ambience
الهدف من هذا
of
التقرير هو
confrontation,
أولا
but the
للحد من تلك
aim
الممارسات
of it is to
التي
limit
يعني
such kind of
تصنف
practices
على أنها انتهاك
which are
لحرية
considered as
التعبير
violations
للعمل
for
السياسي، وأيضا
opinion
تصنف
expression
على
and
أنها
political
يعني
activism,
انتهاك لحقوق الإنسان.
as well as it's a violation for human
في
rights.
الدرجة الأولى. في الدرجة الثانية نريد أن نحد
On
من
the other hand,
هذه
we would like
الإجراءات
to limit
التي
such kind
تستخدم
of
اليوم
measures
القوانين
which are using the
الفضفاضة من أجل
laws,
ملاحقة
the
النشطاء
expanded laws for their own interest in order to prosecute the activists and the opponents in the Gulf countries.
أستطيع أن أستعرض ما قامت به حكومة البحرين.
Perhaps I want to present what the Bahraini government has done since 2011 up to today. Unfortunately, the Bahraini government not only it prosecuted the opponents inside Bahrain and silenced them, and it shut down the only newspaper which belonged to them and the political activism and arrested the human rights activists. It also alleviated its practices outside its borders. In 2011, as we all know, the Bahraini government have oppressed the People's Revolution in Bahrain, and it committed a lot of crimes. It also practiced many other steps in arresting these defendants and these activists, and it also used the criminal police, Interpol, when it handed them a list with the names of the Bahraini opponents. We don't have any criminal issues, but the Bahraini authorities have accused them with false charges and even made trials for them and judged upon them using the law for their own interest upon the law of terrorism and try to prosecute them through Interpol. This is unfortunately. Perhaps all the world witnessed how the Bahraini authorities prosecuted the previous Bahraini player, Hakim Al-Uraibi, and who would be a witness and a participant in this webinar. Hakim Al-Uraibi the whole world have witnessed his suffering, his experience, and in this webinar he will tell us more about it. And since this is a prominent issue, that's why I'm highlighting it. This is only one of the examples. This image only reflects the oppression practiced by this authority, which wanted to get back at its opponents. There are a lot of other examples or experiences who weren't really highlighted, unfortunately, international-wise, and some countries, the Bahraini authorities didn't only use the international Interpol through handing them a list of names, but also it exploited the security agreements, dual agreements between countries, especially between the Gulf Cooperation Council, by virtue of which it arrested a group of Bahrainis, and this is really an unfortunate practice. It's very unfortunate that Bahraini civilians are being arrested in another Gulf country which they seek or sought. This violates the laws of these countries and also the international conventions. Oman, for example, have arrested a group of Bahraini opponents and handed them over to Bahrain. Some of them were judged up to 20 years of imprisonment, others for 4 years, and they were subject to torture. It's not supposed that the Gulf Cooperation Council, a fund or a prison where these opponents are being prosecuted. In 2013, a Bahraini citizen was arrested in Oman and he was handed to the Bahraini authorities. This also happened in 2014. In 2013, Mr. Faisal Al-Alawi was arrested, and right now he's imprisoned in Bahrain, along with another group who were arrested in 2011 while they were being transported by sea on the borders with Qatar. Among them, Martyr Mohammed Zahwan, who was subject to torture and to very ill treatment in the prison, and he died in 2018. Also, Bahrain has gone far more than this. It used the security agreement or the Arab Interpol and circulated the names of the opponents. So if like we have 500 Bahraini immigrants or maybe 1,000, all of their names are circulated. They cannot freely move, even if they had foreign passports or foreign IDs. I recall in 2013, the Egyptian government have prevented one human rights figure who is a Bahraini who came to Egypt not using a Bahraini passport but a foreign passport, but it was also he was also prevented, and also Dr. Ali Al-Badawi, he was prevented from coming to Egypt, although he holds a Canadian nationality. So the Bahraini authorities have been exploiting such agreements and circulated the names. Even I was stopped in the Beirut airport according to this agreement, and Yusuf Zali was also stopped at the airport of Damascus. That's why a lot of activists cannot travel to most of the Arab countries because their names are circulated. This is a true crisis here. We should delve in depth and search for solutions. It's not okay to hand over an Arab national back to his country which he fled. And unfortunately, even the foreign countries which hold laws, and these laws take into consideration the right to be a refugee and not to hand over the wanted or the opponents. However, we witnessed a lot of bad experiences when Holland has handed over Ali Shweikh in 2014. It was 1 month before Hakim Al Uraibi, which happened in Thailand in November 2018. The Dutch authorities have arrested Ali Shweikh as a Bahraini activist in Holland, although he applied for asylum, and instead of being considered as a political refugee, he was arrested and trialed in a quickly manner, in an illegal manner. Then the Dutch authorities have deported him coercively to Bahrain. Right now he is imprisoned in Bahrain. He was subjected to torture, very severe torture, and the attorneys have documented that, and he is judged upon a long sentence in the prison. How did the Dutch authorities do or commit such a practice, which actually violates the international conventions and the international human law, which respects the human rights? That's why the European Union must question the Holland government about this practice. This mistake should be sorted out. On the other hand, Germany, and also according to the international Interpol and the Red Report, Bilal Mahlouzi, who is a Bahraini activist, was arrested when he first arrived to Germany. However, the German authorities once checked the case and found that this arrested person is being arrested only for political reasons. It released him and gave him the right to asylum, and right now he lives in Germany. That's why I believe, as human rights activists and human rights NGOs, really need to consider the prosecution of these activists beyond their borders as a very serious matter. We have a group of recommendations which we have mentioned in our report, Prosecutions Beyond Borders, which also discusses, in addition to the recommendation, that there should be an international advocacy with the international NGOs, and to demand the European Union and the Human Rights Council to issue laws which limit the use of Interpol, especially now that the Emirati officer is now on head of it. We fear for ourselves that now he is the head of this Interpol. I apologize for taking a lot of time, and now we shall hear the other participants' interventions. Thank you. Thank you so much, Yahya, for your intervention on the report and the valuable information. It's as if that the Bahraini authorities didn't stop doing the violations inside the prisons and tried to expand such violations outside its borders and to prosecute the opponents. It's still trying to silence these voices who are speaking up about the violations which are occurring in Bahrain. The proof is the statement which was issued a few days ago by the Ministry of Interior against the Bahraini opponents who held a Bahraini conference in Beirut, and the Lebanese authorities have asked for their deportation. So if you have expelled them outside the country, where do you want them to go? I also believe that the Kuwaiti experience is also one of the most important experiences to be highlighted and to give a further importance. That's why we shall hear Mr. Anwar Rashid intervention, who is a Kuwaiti author and a human rights advisor. Thank you, Mrs. and thank you, Mr. Yahya, for your invitation. I greet you and all the viewers and listeners and your guests. In truth, this webinar, which speaks about the human rights in the Gulf countries, and since I'm the head for the Gulf Forum for the civil societies, we have documented a lot of violations in the Gulf countries. Although that some may view the Kuwaiti experience as an exception in the Gulf countries, I would like to confirm that, unfortunately, instead of having that the Gulf countries follow the policies which subject the human rights respect as Kuwait, it's very clear since the social media bursts around 10 years ago, a lot of laws were issued to restrict the freedoms, and we have political refugees for the first time in the modern Kuwaiti history. The last political immigration happened in Kuwait was in 1938. However, this was settled and the refugees went back to their countries. However, in the last 10 years, we have a lot of political refugees, Kuwaitis, due to their opinions, due to a tweet, due to laws which are restricting the freedoms. And Kuwait today is on top of the whole countries around the world in the judgments issued against the politicians and those who have their own opinion or express their own opinion. And according to what we have documented, these judgments were up to 834 approximately. This is very big number. It can be for political prisoners or for people who just do tweets for in a country which claims to act upon humanity. That's why it should have been otherwise. The Gulf countries follow the Kuwait before. However, unfortunately, Kuwait is now following the pace of the Gulf countries. And I'd like to mention something about the dual security agreements, which Mr. Yahya have mentioned briefly. But I think that these security agreements are very dangerous because they are used to violate the rights, the human rights of the Gulf national through arrestations, through handing them over, as we have witnessed. And many others, like Lujain al-Hadloul, she was handed over to her country in Saudi Arabia from Emirates. And also, as Mr. Yahya mentioned, how other activists were handed over to Bahrain and from Qatar to Saudi Arabia. Also, some of them were kidnapped, like Talal al-Rashid was kidnapped from Kuwait to Saudi Arabia. So we are living in this spiral, which is unlawful and which violates our rights as Gulf nationals in a very frank and obvious way. For truth, I didn't get to meet the foreign guest who is with us. It's the first time I meet him in this webinar. He is the head of Human Rights Watch in the Middle East. This is very good. You are very welcome. I'm very glad that he is among us so that you would hear our opinion as activists in a direct way what's really going on in the Gulf countries. We are truly going through a serious crisis, a serious terror. We are the only countries around the world which an activist who is being judged for 3 charges, 10 imprisonment years, 10 years of being forbidden to use any social media or media, and also 10 years being forbidden from traveling, a travel ban. These are charges that are being issued for people who tweet in Gulf countries, people who are activists. We have witnessed such cases and documented this. This actually would lead to immigration. Let me go further with this point if the time allows. We want to deliver a message to the European community and the international community in general. Your silence, the silence of the foreign community for these violations and what's happening from wars and from prison, which shall lead eventually to the immigration of the opponents to your country, to the European countries, to the American country. And there's a statistics that after 10 years, after the Arab and Islamic culture has been transferred to your country, a statistics study was done, and due to the high population of Arab nationals in Europe, they would be much higher than those of Europeans. And after a while, they would be a Christian minority in their own countries, and this doesn't serve you on the long run, like in 30, 40, or maybe 100 years. They have come to your country, they have transferred their own culture, and even if they were asked to merge in the society, it's not very possible. In addition to the many terrorist acts that happened in Madrid and in a lot of European capitals or cities, this is a result because you as foreigners are being silent or turning a blind eye for what these countries are doing from violations because of your own interests, like aircrafts, agreement, or any other kind of commercial agreement which you think that might revive your own economy. These agreements are being purchased by the Gulf authorities. Through such agreements, they are buying these stamps with their dollars, with their money. And we have witnessed the last visit which the French head of republic done to the Gulf countries, and how many billions of dollars he has earned through this visit. Despite all of the violations that's being committed for human rights, that's why I wish from you, my colleague, to not only monitor and document these violations. We hope that they would share us to exercise pressure on the European governments to push towards having these these royal families who are ruling in the Gulf countries to be otherwise, not to end up ruling also over Europe. And I would also want you as foreign communities. The Gulf countries are trying to purchase supporting stance with it through these agreements, which serve only on a short run. I'd like to conclude here and say that the world knows, and the foreign governments and the international human rights NGOs knows about the human rights violations, which are very serious violations. When opponents are being imprisoned without any trials for tens of years, some of them have even died, like Dr. Abdallah Al-Hamid and others, other activists who have lost their lives without having their cases highlighted, without having committed any crime other than demanding for democracy, which is a human right according to the democratic regimes, except for our regimes. So when you as foreign countries wonder why Arabs hate us or why Muslims hate us, we don't hate you as people. We hate the policies of your governments, which are an alliance for our governments who are violating our rights. So you can't have dual standards, that you speak about human rights issues and at the same time you make deals with such regimes which violate us. We do not hate you, but we really demand you with total humanity and dignity to confess that we are humans and we have the right to live freely and to develop our countries. And this is a legal right for our freedom. Thank you, Mr. Anwar, for your intervention and for the information you have presented on what's going on inside Kuwait. I think that Mr. Anwar was trying to send a message to the governments who are cooperating with the Gulf authorities, the Arab authorities in general, but we cannot deny the very important role of the international NGOs in documenting and focusing on what's going violations in the Gulf countries especially. And we can only mention that we cannot generalize judgments. Each state or each government has its own circumstances. Now we will be with Adam Kugel, the Vice President of Human Rights Watch in the Middle East and North Africa. Adam, I know that you can speak Arabic, but you may speak in English because you prefer it. So speak in whatever language you prefer. The platform is yours.
I am going to speak in English.
سوف أتكلم بالإنجليزية لأنها أسهل لي. فشكرا لتحملي هنا. أولا أود أن أتشكركم على دعوتي للمشاركة في هذه الندوة. إنه موضوع مهم.
Middle East Division of Human Rights Watch, and I've had focus on the Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for quite a few years. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about how the Gulf countries and authoritarian regimes in general use repressive laws and practices to target dissidents, especially those abroad. And I thank the Gulf Institute for their great contribution to this topic, and look forward to reading their report in greater detail. I think it's the first thing to mention here is that Gulf countries have always used repressive laws and practices to eliminate dissent in their countries. I mean, I think you can't paint with a broad brush. Some countries in the Gulf have a little bit more relaxed speech standards than others. For example, you might say more in Kuwait than you can say in Saudi Arabia, but I don't want to go too far because all of these countries have repressive laws. If you look at these laws, and Mr. Yahya pointed this out, they're very vague. And, they're written in such a way that they create a way for authoritarian regimes to stop almost any speech whatsoever. I mean, almost anything could fit into these vague laws because they mean nothing. Just to give you a few examples, in Saudi Arabia, you can go to prison for, being charged with distorting the reputation of the kingdom. Whatever that means, you can get arrested based on the cybercrime law in jail for 5 years for disturbing public order, religious values, or public morals. In the UAE, you can get jailed for 10 years for insulting the state and the prestige of the country and its symbols. And Oman, as my friend Nabhan knows very well, you can get a conviction for insulting the Sultan and undermining public security. In Bahrain, insulting national institutions, and so on and so forth. I mean, the picture I'm trying to paint here is that all of these countries have laws that they actively use to eliminate criticism and dissent, and they've done so for a long time. This is not a new phenomenon. I think that the important thing to keep in mind in terms of these laws that are specifically designed to limit criticism or political opposition or freedom of speech in general is that they don't really mean anything. They're so vague that they they can be used in an arbitrary manner by authorities to just target certain people, and that's what these laws are for. The other thing that's important to know about these laws is you can't defend yourself in court from them. You can't, if a prosecutor is charging you with insulting a national symbol, and that behavior is already deemed to be criminal just by the very nature of the fact that you've been charged with it as a crime. What you often see in these countries is that people try to argue that they didn't actually say the thing. They never argue whether the thing that was said should be considered criminal or not, right? So these are all unfair trials, right? You can't defend yourself from a charge that itself violates human rights or the spirit of human rights, international human rights law. So I think those are the important things to mention. Now, like I said, these kinds of laws and regulations have always been used to target dissidents and critics inside the country. I think what's new in the last 5 to 10 years that we've begun to see, and really what the subject of the Gulf Institute's new report is about, is the way in which the authorities have extended these abusive legislation or legislative regimes and practices to go after people who are outside the country. And we've seen, this trend, unfortunately, growing in a lot of the countries. And there's unfortunately numerous examples. I think it goes along with the other important point that the Gulf regimes in general are very external looking now, right? They're not so internalized as they used to be, looking in on themselves. They have, for various reasons, have a much more sort of international outlook and are trying to manage their reputations internationally. And this is really why they're so concerned about Gulf dissidents abroad, like my friend Nabhan here. This is why they care so much, because they do care about their reputations. And this is especially true for Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, but it's also true of the others like Bahrain as well. What we've seen, unfortunately, or actually, I just want to say, evidence of the fact that the Gulf regimes care more about their images than they used to is, if you look at their diplomatic engagements and their attempts to exert influence in other countries. So, for example, almost all of the Gulf countries have been trying to actively get on the Human Rights Council in recent years. Some of them have done it. Bahrain's on it right now. Saudi Arabia has been on it. UAE has been on it, and the others as well. And they're doing that specifically just to try to improve their image, to show, hey, we're participating with the international human rights infrastructure. We care about human rights, while not actually changing a lot of the abusive regimes that they have that actually limit free expression. They're doing it for PR reasons. We've also seen that they are investing phenomenal resources in, improving their image in specific countries like the US and the UK, whether that's through investments like buying football teams, or in the UK, I should say, and in the US, investing a lot of money in lobbyists and high-profile people to try to, do PR for them. These are ways in which the Gulf really is showing that it cares how it's perceived abroad, and that's why they're so concerned about the dissidents and the damage that they can do, right, by telling the truth about the situations in these countries. So we've seen an escalating use of tactics to try to target people abroad. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of these. Number one, convictions in absentia. I'm sure my dear friend Nabhan can talk about that. But people charging activists abroad, convicting them in courts, just to make their lives a little bit more difficult. Obviously, they can't go home and visit anymore. Many of them have to then file for asylum status in whatever country they're in. So that makes it a little bit harder. Number two, targeting family members who remain in the country. We've seen this increasingly in recent years. Just to give you a couple of examples, the well-known Saudi dissident Omar Abdulaziz, his brothers were detained in direct retaliation for his online criticism while he was in Canada, and they still remain in detention, held essentially as hostages. You also have Sayyid Ahmed al-Wadai's family, the Bahraini dissident in London, whose family was targeted. And there are a lot of other examples of this, many of which we've heard about, but have never been publicized because people are concerned about their family members, right? So they don't want to publicize these threats, but, we've heard. There are numerous cases of this, and it's an increasing practice, unfortunately. Another strategy Gulf regimes follow is to try to prevent dissidents from leaving the country in the first place, right? So you have arbitrary and unjust travel bans that are imposed on people, even if they've completed their sentences. They can essentially never leave the country, they're trapped. And the reason for that is the governments don't want them to be able to get abroad and become dissidents who can affect the narrative. The family, for example, of Lujaina Hadlou is an example. They're all travel banned. Almost all of the Saudis who have been detained in recent years, their family members are all travel banned. Walid Fatahi, the physician, this is an increasing practice. And then finally, you have practices like the UAE harassing people by filing spurious Interpol red notices against dissidents and others, or in the case of the UAE, declaring dissidents abroad to be terrorists, like we've seen in 4 recent examples. And unfortunately, these are the normal practices. Of course, on the far end of the spectrum, you also have the direct physical threat to dissidents, and this is, of course, most embodied in the so-called Tiger Squad, the hit team set up by MBS to target dissidents abroad. Of course, we all know about the horrible crime and the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul, and the targeting of other dissidents as well, and the kidnapping of other dissidents abroad. Unfortunately, we can expect a lot more of this kind of behavior in the future as Gulf regimes continue to care about their reputations, but don't care enough to actually fix their practices and their laws, and want to continue their authoritarian regimes in the way that they're currently constituted, and also stop dissidents abroad and maintain a positive reputation more broadly. So I think, in my view, it's up to the human rights movement and others to do everything we can to try to shed light on this issue, and to do what we can to prevent the regimes in the Gulf from getting away with this, right? We need to continue to figure out ways in which we can highlight, the crimes and the abuses these regimes are committing, and prevent them from whitewashing their reputations, or sports washing their reputations, or whatever else they try to do. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your very
شكرا
informative
جزيلا لك
intervention or
آدم
speech.
لمداخلتك
أود أن أسلط الضوء على ما
I would
ذكره
like to
آدم
highlight what
من أن
Adam
السلطات
mentioned,
تتهم المعارضين
that
بالإرهاب
the
أو تستخدم قوانين
authorities
الإرهاب
are
والقوانين الجنائية
accusing the
كما
opponents
حدث
with
مع أكثر
terrorism and
من
using
شخصية
criminal
معارضة
charges,
خليجية.
as happened with
فاستطلنا
one
بعدها
more than
التقرير الذي
a
سيكون بين
Gulf
أيديكم بعد الندوة مباشرة.
figure, which you will see
تتهم بعض
examples of
المعارضين
mentioned in the report.
تحت قوانين الإرهاب والقوانين
They are
الجنائية
subjecting them or judging them upon criminal charges to justify their arrestation and imprisonment. Now we shall be with Mr. Nabhan Al-Harish, the executive head for the Human Rights Organization. Mr. Nabhan. Thank you for inviting me, and I salute all the guests and the listeners and followers. My name is Nabhan Al-Hanshi. I'm the Executive Director for Al-Qist Human Rights Organization and the Romanian Center for Human Rights. At the beginning, I'd like to focus on speaking on the international Interpol, especially after the Emirati General became the head of the Interpol. Unfortunately, we cannot no longer depend on the international law on protecting ourselves as activists or asylum seekers outside our countries, whether it was by force or by our own will. The international Interpol integrity is now questioned, especially that the Emirati rulers, since the Arab Spring, they try to defame all kinds of revolutions, and they try to support the military wise against such revolutions and to defame such revolutions, that these revolutions only led to destruction in the end. So accepting Al-Raisi candidacy, as I think that the international Interpol is now going through a moral crisis, especially that there are a lot of torture and ill-treatment cases, like the British Matthew, who was detained in Emirates a few years ago. It's unfortunate that an international institution that's supposed to be acting as a police to protecting the civilians, 95 states are members of it, to have such a person be a candidate for it, using the international Interpol in order to prosecute the opponents. We have already witnessed in the Arab countries, as Egypt did after the military became in charge, and also what happened in Bahrain. And I think Mr. Hakim shall speak about his experience and what happened. And also Mr. Yahya mentioned one of the examples when he spoke about Bahrain and how it exploited such law. And also we have Algeria and what it did with the founder of Al-Karama institution, Mr. Rashid. Also we have witnessed this with Tunisia and the mandate of Zain al-Abidin. Perhaps all or this organization would justify its practices that these defendants are accused with terrorism or killing or others, but we know for sure that such terrorizing countries, oppressing countries as the Arab countries, especially the Gulf countries, there is no monitoring in what they do. So it's very easy that these countries exploit such laws against these opponents and defendants, because there is no internal monitoring for the performance of these authorities, neither for how these laws are applied. The other point I'd like to point to that this thing isn't limited to handing over the opponents to their countries' regimes. I mean here being arrested by the international Interpol, but just that the opponents are being among the list of wanted or issuing the read reports against them, they would be at risk of losing their jobs, travel bans, denying them the right to extract any visas to visit other countries, and all of these consequences, as it happened with Mr. Al Hakim, that they would be imprisoned in the countries for months or maybe years before they're being released or being confirmed that they are innocent, and drop the criminal charges against them. I expect that today that the problem isn't limited to the presidency of Raisi for this organization or this committee, but we fear, if we speak about the financial support for this organization, probably it's conditioned in an indirect way. Also, Mr. Yahya mentioned when he spoke about the Security Gulf Agreement, and Mr. Anwar mentioned, and also Mr. Adam mentioned, which is handing over the Gulf opponents from a Gulf country to another country. So will the Emirates, for example, provide services for its sister countries to hand over opponents who live in foreign countries like in US or any other place, and hunt them and arrest them in the foreign airports? These are many questions. Even though that the head of the Interpol Al Raisi and the Secretary General Geraint Chok, who was elected for another mandate, is the real head, but still we have all of these fears and concerns. We expect as Gulf activists and Arab defendants who live outside, we play a very important role. We should play an important role in to avoid such a mistake, which puts us at risk, and also to use the parliaments in the countries which we live in to advocate for such cases in the future. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Mr. Nabhan, for your very valued intervention. I want to salute Ala As-Sadiq, the human rights defendants who struggled for long hours for reforming the human rights cases and had a lot of human rights violations even after her death. May her soul rest in peace. Now we shall be with Hakim Al-Uraibi. He was imprisoned in Bahrain, and he was also prosecuted outside of Bahrain, as he shall tell us more about his experience. Greetings. Thank you, Mr. Yahya, for welcoming me here and giving me the opportunity to share my own story with you. My name is Hakim Al-Uraibi. I'm Bahraini and Australian national. I used to play with Al Bahrain Foot Club before. I shall speak about what I encountered and the torture I was subject to by the security authorities in Bahrain, and the foreign authorities in Bahrain. In 2012, in November, I was 19 years old. We were celebrating my birthday when I and my friends went to the party. We had an investigation unit in Al Sidra area. They stopped us and asked me about my name. I told them my name is Hakim Al-Uraibi, and the policeman, he knew that I was a player for Al Bahrain club, and he asked me to come with them to the Al Khamis police station. And when I arrived there, they started hitting me on my body, and they started insulting my religious sect. and chanting popular songs. I don't know what they meant by this. They started telling me, you shall not play football again. You are from a religious sect that we hate, and you will remain in prison forever. And they accused me falsely with the charge of assaulting a police station. On the same date, I was playing football at one of these stats, and I had a lot of proofs and evidences that I wasn't there, and this football game was publicly broadcasted. This really helped me in seeking asylum, and after they released me, I joined the Bahraini national club, and I earned a lot of championships. Then I went to Qatar, and I was judged in absentia for 10 years. I was really surprised for this judgment, and I thought that the court would release me because I provided evidences proving me innocent. I was surprised with this 10 years of imprisonment sentence. Then I went from Qatar to Iran. What made me go to Iran is because that the Iran, it's very difficult to hand me over to Bahrain, and I didn't know about seeking asylum. After Iran, I went to Malaysia, and I stayed there for 6 months, then to Thailand, and I remained there in 2014 for 1 month. Then I went to Australia and applied for humanitarian asylum. All of these years passed in Australia. In 2016, Sheikh Salman bin Al Ibrahim is one of the ruling members. He was a candidate of FIFA, and the NGOs like Human Rights Watch and all these sports organizations tried to highlight my case in Bahrain. This was in 2016, before I was arrested in Thailand. This person is a racist, and he didn't help me when I was in Bahrain, when I was arrested in Bahrain by the police. And I used to tell the NGOs that I don't recommend that such a person becomes a candidate for heading the FIFA. And thanks God that he wasn't successful in that. And I think because of this, Bahrain remained prosecuting me while I was in Australia in 2018, August 2018. Bahrain issued a red notice in my name for the Interpol, and I was heading to Thailand. And before I went to Thailand, let me just go a little back. Before I went to the Thailand embassy to provide for a tourism visa with my wife, on the same day I had my visas issued, and Interpol judgment was issued against me. Until now, I don't know how the Bahraini authorities knew that I was going to Thailand. In all ways, in November, I went to Thailand with my wife to have fun, spend a quality time, and as a honeymoon also. When I arrived to Bangkok airport, and before leaving the airport, around 20 policemen from the Thailand, and they asked about my name, and they told me, come with us, we shall return you back to Bahrain. I told them, I'm an Australian national, why would you send me back to Bahrain? They told me, you are charged with assaulting and attacking a police station. I told them this is a false accusation, and I have evidences proving my innocence, and I'm an asylum seeker in Australia, and Australia accepted my application. You have no right whatsoever to send me back to Bahrain. And they wanted me to sign papers, and I refused that, and I remained in Thailand like 72 days.
ثم البحرين رفضت اللي هو او نقول انها كنسلت اللي هو طلب استردادي الى البحرين.
Then the Bahraini authorities dropped down, retrieving me back to Bahrain. I'd like to clarify here one point. My case is very clear. If I had any true accusations or charges, then why would the Bahraini authorities drop retrieving me back? But I thank God that I managed to go back to Australia. And until today, I live in terror, especially when this Emirate General is a candidate for the presidency of Interpol. It's really bothering me whenever I think about that, because what I lived in Thailand and what I saw in Bahrain from torture makes me really fear traveling around and in all times concerned. I hope from this webinar and from other NGOs to do anything to stop this, or to not allow that this person be in such a post, because this person would make us as Gulf nationals, as Gulf activists, in a total concern, continuous concern. And as you know, that the Gulf authorities, especially the Bahraini and the Saudis, I have no idea about Kuwait or Oman, but in Bahrain or Saudi, any political activist shall be subject to torture or shall be killed or would be obliged to leave their countries, as our case. So I hope that the NGOs would take a look into this and help us. Thank you. Thank you so much, Hakim. And we feel very unfortunate to what happened to you in Bahrain and outside Bahrain. I would like to highlight the important role of the international NGOs, the human rights advocacy. When one of the Gulf nationals are arrested, what happened in the case of Hakim and Abdel Ilah Al-Mahdi in Germany, for example. Now we come to conclude this webinar for today. I thank my guests for these valued interventions and the information, and the translator for her efforts, and you for following us. I'd like to note that the report, which is prepared by the Gulf Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, Bahrain Prosecutions Beyond Borders, we shall find you wherever you are, would be published on the website, and we shall publish both links in Arabic and English on the social media platforms. Thank you.